All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of our series and week 4 of class. Really excited. We're going to have Miss Hu, speaking soon and doing an action lab. Really excited about that. Obviously, that's in the next hour. So I will be going through my, my weekly spiel, and then we will get into the presentation. I don't have something which I have here. So here we go. So welcome to the, the slideshow is not. There we go. So welcome to the Epidemics of Injustice course. So the theme for this year's class is co-disrupting and co-conspirators. So please, people, introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, pronouns. If you have not completed the check-in form, please do so. There's also a QR code you can scan, and this is also available on the Google Classroom site for community members. For students, this is in the Blackboard site. You go to week 4, and it will be there in the PowerPoints. During the presentation, please put your comments or questions, anything like that, in the chat for me, please. And there'll be time for questions at the end. So this is how to use the Zoom participant controls: mute, chat, start video. If you want to show your video, you do not have to. Let's see. Here's us again. We are the instruction team for this class: Katie, Nandini, and myself, Washika Torres. So about the course. This annual course is free and open to the public, and it prepares public health leaders and community members with the tools to bring about social change and address structural determinants of health. All course meetings take place virtually, and the course is open to students and the public from 5:30 to 6:30 CST. And obviously, when daylight savings changes, that will shift as well, but it'll still be 5:30 to 6:30. Students taking the course for credit will stay from 6:30 to 7:30 for a closed discussion, and you all know that's another link that you can find at the Blackboard site. The Epidemics of Injustice is sponsored by the Collaboratory for Health Justice at the USC School of Public Health. And we would also like to thank Radical Public Health for the creation, support, and promotion of this program. RPH is celebrating its 11th year. So for more information about RPH, please visit their Facebook page. You just type in Radical Public Health, and this is the sign, so it should pop up. So content warning: today's lecture could contain materials that might be difficult to discuss. Step away if you need to take care of yourself during the presentation or, even during the activity. So the land acknowledgement: the Collaboratory for Health Justice acknowledges that the University of Illinois Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the 3 Fire peoples. I got my guide. The Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. Purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. This area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the U.S. Illinois is also the territory of the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and their descendants. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy. Living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonialization and state violence and support Indigenous community struggle for self-determination and sovereignty. So here are the community guidelines. Please show up on time and be prepared. Let everyone participate. Please listen with an open mind. Have mutual respect and appreciation for one another. And I say this every time, and I really mean it. Please respect the privacy and personal information shared during class. What is here, what is generated here. People will be sharing personal things and things that are very close to them. So please respect that. So this week's talk is on restorative justice and healing justice, and we have Miss Nguyen. So Nguyen is a community organizer, cultural worker, social architect, and a restorative justice facilitator who was born in Central Vietnam, grew up in Salisbury, North Carolina, and politicized in Chicago. After receiving 3 Bachelor's of Science degrees in botany, biological sciences, and biochemistry from North Carolina State University in 2000. She relocated to Chicago in 2001 as a doctoral student in the Department of Pharmacognosy, concentrating in medical ethnobotany at the University of Illinois Chicago. She received her Ph.D. in 2008. So sorry, it's Dr. Nguyen. Her passion is ideating and co-creating systems that are life-affirming while simultaneously addressing and reducing harm in the predominant systems. As one among a few handfuls of women in the U.S. who is a contra maestra in capoeira, Angola, a cultural practice that emerged in response to the violence of the slave systems in Brazil. She is devoted to sharing its liberatory practice as a pathway toward both individual and collective healing, as well as mutual liberation. In order to be fully present for her teenage daughters and extended family, she recently stepped down as the Director of Youth Development at Palenque LSNA, formerly known as Logan Square Neighborhood Association, where she organized around healing-centered engagement and restorative justice practices in Chicago public schools. She lives on the south side of Chicago with her 2 teens and husband and enjoys walking on her hands and singing to her plants. So, and if you, I'll just go over that, don't worry. You will see me again. So please welcome Dr. Nguyen, who's giving her talk, sorry. Thank you so much. And I will stop my video and let her start.
Thank you, Ashika. Thank you so much for grounding us in the norms and the introduction. I'm also gonna start to share my screen here. Give me a second. Okay, so can I just get a thumbs up or hear somebody unmute themselves and say they can see this actual welcome screen? Excellent. Okay, so thank you all. I see that, yeah, you all have put out your names and preferred pronouns already in the chat. And so we can actually, unless I actually would like to kind of get just, you know, a mapping of who all is in the room. So if you don't mind, if you could share, if you feel comfortable sharing what neighborhood or area you're joining us from, that would be really great. And just curious, you know, today in Brazil is Day of Iemanjá. And so there's this beautiful procession, you know, at the beach and the ocean where they do these offerings. And so it made me think about the waters a lot as I sit here in the South Side by this beautiful Lake Michigan. And so I'm just curious, and again, feel free if you want to answer this, but you prefer being in seawater or fresh water or no water? Some people don't like being in the water at all. So just love to get a little gauge of who else in our room here. No water. All right, so we have folks from all over Chicago and the Greaterland area. Some suburbs here, wonderful. I love that. The Jamila Woods kind of water. Yes. Brackish water. All right. Thank you. And I'll get a chance to go back hopefully and catch up on the chat. But I'm going to go ahead and move us along. All right. And I love that you all already did a land acknowledgement, so we can really move straight into what I'm calling land reverence. And when I think about reverence, right, we're thinking about a deep respect and gratitude, right? And so I just want to do a quick grounding and gratitude practice because I know, again, right, it's 5:45 on a Thursday. We're coming here into this space from, you know, all the other things that happened today and earlier this week. And, you know, we're in very different mental and emotional states, right? Imagine all of us in different places. And so wanting to just ground us and gather us together here so that we can, you know, at least for the next hour, or at least now it's 45 minutes, kind of be on a collective frequency together. And since you all did such a beautiful job, Washika, just going to add this part here. But I want to just, you know, say that yeah, I'm really grateful, right, to be able to organize with communities and raise my family. on land, right? Then the indigenous people who are the original caretakers of what they've called this, what we call United States, they've called Turtle Island. And I'm aware, right, that I am a settler on this stolen land. I understand that the policies and the procedures that led to the seizing of this unceded territory is what led to the genocide of the First Nations people, and that those policies and procedures are the thread that weaves the fabric of our current policies and procedures that maintain the structures of police terror and state-sanctioned violence. So I'm going to ask if we can just take a moment of silence, and we're going to send some love to the families of Tyree Nichols, of Keenan Anderson, of Manuel Terrain, as well as the numerous others whose names we know and do not know. And as we acknowledge this grief in our moment of silence of the loss of the lives due to the state-sanctioned terror, I just ask that you connect to that sacred rage and that sacred fire that will hopefully lead us towards a collective action. Okay. So if you could come back, let's just take a minute and take some breaths. Take some deep breaths, slow inhalations through your nose. Slow, deep exhalation out of your mouth. So I just want to ground us in this quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. And she says, and while expressing gratitude seems innocent enough, it's a revolutionary idea. In a consumer society, contentment is a radical proposition. Recognizing abundance rather than scarcity undermines an economy that thrives by creating unmet desires. And I would add that this economy, I would name that it's a racial capitalist, right, market economy that we're in. And so I want us to think about this quote, because there are things in it that I'll be referring back to, as you'll see throughout this workshop. Okay, so these are the main questions that I'm sort of raising for us today, and they're questions that actually guide my work every single day. And I hope that through our time together, these questions will spark more questions that can lead to responses that support us in our commitment towards interrupting and upending the multiple and intersecting injustices that our communities continue to experience. And so what is healing justice? Just gonna click here, oops, excuse me. And can you all see the website that has just appeared on the screen, at least on my screen? Can somebody give me yes, thumbs up? Thank you. So this is a site, and you all will receive this slide deck. And so all of this website will be at your fingertip. But if I could have someone just unmute, because I feel like I'm going to be doing a lot of talking. So folks, anybody will unmute and read this last part for me. We're starting at we are learning and creating, and then reading the remainder of that page. Any volunteer?
I can read it. This is chiropractor. I'm in Peoria. So it says, we are learning and creating this political framework about a legacy of healing and liberation that is meeting a particular moment in history inside of our movements that seeks to regenerate traditions that have been lost, to mindfully hold contradictions in our practices, and to be conscious of the conditions we are living and working inside of as healers and organizers in our communities and movements. Healing justice is being used as a framework that seeks to lift up resiliency and wellness practices as a transformative response to generational violence and trauma in our communities. Ashe Lawson, we do not seek to promote single healers as one model, nor models of healing as singular, nor to build individualized care, but to build mechanisms and systems that builds collective wellness, transforms generational trauma and violence, and builds quality care that is accessible to all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to move it back to the slides here. And so just to give you a brief context, and actually, let me just stop sharing for a second so I can see you all. Just to give you a context of what that particular moment in history that led to the birth of this healing justice framework. So in 2005, as a response to the crisis of trauma and violence and social conditions in the region of the Gulf after a series of hurricanes, known as Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, Cara Page, who is a healing practitioner, an artist and organizer based in Atlanta, Georgia, began holding conversations with Southern-based spiritual and healing practitioners and organizers to really assess the need to build a collective that would centralize healing resources, build the capacity to respond to trauma in the Southern movements, through holistic healing models, and to create healing models with a social justice context that supported and sustained the well-being of the organizers, right? And in doing so, she created and introduced this concept of healing justice, which has become, again, this framework about understanding the legacy of how transgenerational trauma has been connected to an ongoing history and cycle of genocide and slavery. And so healing justice names that healing transgenerational trauma is absolutely tied to political liberation. And by political liberation, she and others engaged in healing justice framework to really, again, understand and name the systems that have created these traumas in order to begin healing and healing not only the individual selves, right, but the collective communities that are embedded in this framework. So I just wanted to give you all that context. And again, you'll have this deck, and so you'll be able to go and explore her website. Oops, excuse me. There we go. Her website and her organization. And then the other questions, around how is healing related to community organizing? I think I, sort of laid out that framework a little bit, given the history and the context of healing justice. And what you'll find here, and actually I'm going to go here as well to Prentice Hemphill, another amazing Black queer organizer who I'm learning so much from. And I think for the sake of time, I won't have us read all of their definition of what healing justice means. But if I could get someone to read, because I would love for someone to read perhaps these last 4 bullet points. If anybody feels compelled to unmute and to read, that'd be great.
I could read it.
Thank you.
My name's Safwa. Healing justice means that we identify the institutions that interrupt and undermine our individual and collective abilities to heal. And in those places, we organize towards change and interrupt our dependence, be it against the apparatus of the medical industrial complex or against harmful and life-depleting food systems. Healing justice means that we begin to value care, emotional labor, and resilience, not as add-ons, but as central components of sustainability that restore us to life. Healing justice means that we realize that care and accountability are at the root of healing justice practice and are some of the most difficult and direct actions we can take. Care and accountability requires us to reveal, to center, and more than anything, to change. Healing justice means that these interventions and so many more not yet imagined can no longer be pushed to the margins of our work, but we must be central and given our attention and time.
Thank you so much. And that last part I love in bold and caps. We heal so that we can act and organize. And so for me, that just, it really encapsulated so well this idea, right? This relationship between healing and community organizing. Because we know, right, again, if we use the context of how healing justice came about, right, as the response to Hurricane Katrina, because I'm guessing there's some folks here who may be too young to remember 2005. And for me, it was one of the first times to really see how intentional, right, that our government and again, this naming of the state sanctioned violence, that there were resources that were not being brought into those communities, right? So the abandonment of the people in the Gulf and the aftermath of those hurricanes, it was really a nodal point for the Southern movement. And, it brought again to the surface of questions of sustainability for movement organizers, right? We're talking about their social, their physical, generational traumas. We're talking about the rapid response capacity and the role of the state as the oppressor. So social justice leaders, especially women of color, particularly Black women, responded and developed practices for resilience and uncovering Southern Indigenous and Black histories of survival and healing mechanisms that are certainly shaping our movement today, right? And so Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective is the organization that Cara Page ended up starting, which emerged in this environment and put forth this healing justice framework. And so I really just wanted to uplift that. And I know in my work as a community organizer, when I was working at Palenque LSNA, our communities had to organize exactly because they weren't getting the resources, right, that they deserved. And I know Dr. David Stovall was with you all last week, and so I'm sure he contextualized, right, the idea that these aren't vulnerable populations, they're not under-resourced. I remember hearing him talk about it for the first time and naming it and just feeling like, yes, that's it. We have to name that these communities that we're organizing in are communities that have historically and systematically been considered disposable, right? Which is why they don't have the resources they need, which is why we're out there working with our community members for them, to learn to advocate for themselves. What are the resources that they need and deserve? And so for us, when I was organizing with and directing the youth development at Palenque LSNA, central to our policy was always, our motto was really racial healing as a matter of public policy, right? And so for me, that's a very clear, and we there are many wins, right? And they're little, right? But there's still wins where we were able to get the Emmett Street apartments, right, for 100% affordable housing units in Logan Square. We've organized, right, with ICER to help, pass ordinance for sanctuary cities. And so this is, when we think about organizing, we're thinking about also, right, this idea, and I'm not going to go into it today, but about decolonizing ourselves, right? And that is a part of the healing. And so I'm gonna, sorry, I want to go back to those questions. And so this really, this conversation, these questions then ask us to really think about, ask me to think about, then how do we build communities of care, right? And there is a link here, and I'm not sure how many of us were able to read this article by Adrienne Marie Brown, again, another amazing facilitator and organizer who really has this healing justice framework in her organizing and in her workshops as well. But I just, before we get to that, I really want to just pause for a minute and ask folks, with a show of hands, and I'm going to try to open my screen here so I can see you all. But how many of you all think you live in communities that have the resources you need to address man-made and or natural disasters. Anybody? Give me a second, I'm going to scroll through. Raise your hand if you think your community has the resources it needs. Okay, I see a few hands. Thank you, Mitchell, Summers. But so far, I'm only seeing 2 hands out of however many, out of 138 people. Okay. 3, 4 hands so far. Okay, so that's not a lot. That's a very low percentage of folks on this Zoom meeting that feels like you're living in a community with the resources that you need, right? And again, we don't have to look back too far in our history, right? To see that the public health infrastructure in the US and quite possibly around the majority of our globe is non-existent, right? And I think honestly, it's because there's not an existing social infrastructure, right? Which is a term that Eric Cleninger, I think is his name. I have it in the resources, so you can take a look. But he coined this term, I think back in 2013, about social infrastructure, which really just refers to the physical places and organizations that shape the way people interact. Right. And so I think when I'm thinking about public health infrastructure, I'm not separating that from this idea of social infrastructure. So the organizations and the physical spaces. Think about libraries, right? Think about our public schools, and think about in the last just 10, 15 years in Chicago, how these public social infrastructures have been intentionally dismantled. Right. And so this is why we organize. Does anybody have, really quickly, and I'm trying to manage the time here, because I want to make sure I leave room for some question and answers, but does anybody want to give an example of any community organizing that they feel has, that have led to or are connected to healing in your communities? I think we might have time for 1 or 2. Feel free to just unmute, or if you feel more comfortable, to put in the chat.
I'll speak up.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I'm Rachel Ralia. I'm actually in New Mexico. I work in injury and violence prevention, but I previously worked in Title V. And thank you so much for holding these sessions because they're just so wonderful. Here in New Mexico, we have, I don't like the phrase, but we're a majority state. So we actually have less non-Hispanic white people than we do of people of other races and ethnicities. We have a really large indigenous population here, and part of that is with Navajo Nation, but we also have separate tribes and pueblos as well. And so some of the restorative justice that's happening in New Mexico is around reproductive justice and birth justice. And so we have some really fantastic organizations such as Tewa Women United and Bold Futures, and as well as some others. And they're just really doing some really fabulous work. Anything and everything from teaching Indigenous families how to practice their cultural birthing and kind of postpartum practices, to kind of reclaiming their labor and reclaiming their food and nutrition. And it's just a really beautiful connection to witness. And so I just wanted to share that as a wonderful example.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing. That is wonderful. And right, and that's part of when I think about, right, this movement for liberation, right, for Black liberation and BIPOC liberation, it's also this movement that's very connected to Indigenous sovereignty, right? And so that reclaiming of these traditional ways of healing and food systems is absolutely, to me, very much connected to community organizing and healing. So thank you so much for those examples. So again, I think for the consideration of time, I'm going to leave this question of how do we build communities of care really just open-ended right now. And should we have time, we can go back. Again, when you get this deck, you're going to be able to click on this link, and it takes you to this beautiful very short article that Adrienne Marie Brown writes as a response to another organizer who writes something about like the end of self-care, right? And again, these are terms that are popping up. I think they've become very popular in the movement in the last 5-6 years, and even in corporations, right? And like more, you know, higher ed institutes, like this idea of self-care and community care, right? So yeah, I'm just gonna leave it at that for a moment. And I think as I talk us through, you know, the next few slides, it's going to actually tie in and give you some concrete examples of how we actually build communities of care. And then the other one, again, this is a much more, again, open-ended rhetorical kind of question that I want us to think about, right? Is how do we remain well inside systems that actually do not want us to be well or already associate us with disease? Okay, and so let me see here. I'm going to try to sum up for me what I imagine when I think about this course, right, around epidemics of injustices. And the organizing work that I really got heavily involved with and still am was with the public education here in the city, right? My daughters started preschool, the older one started preschool right at the same year that Rahm Emanuel became mayor, and then immediately closed down 50 schools in Black and Brown communities. And so my lens is when I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about you know, organizing with immigrant communities and organizing for fair housing, right? And as I think about that in the context of public health and medicine, which is actually the field that I was in when I was studying at UIC, I feel like they're all connected to this philosophy that I'm calling the pathologies, right? And under this and inside this box, what I'm suggesting, and this is also the resources that I'm gathering, right, have come from these various organizers, but also very much influenced by Dr. Sean Ginwright, who I'll refer to in a minute, who coined this idea of healing-centered engagement, which again is very much a framework of healing justice. So when I think of the pathologies kind of philosophy that we see very much in, you know, School of Public Health, very much in School of Medicine, College of Medicine, College of Pharmacy, which was what I studied in, we see that we're really treating symptoms. Right. So when we're closing down schools because we're saying, oh, they're underutilized, under-resourced, we're treating a symptom. Right. We're looking at things from a deficit-based lens. And often what happens with that kind of lens is like we're really actually looking at life annihilating systems. Right. We think about, again, trauma-informed care, right, which is really, again, kind of singling out the traumas and looking at that as a deficit. And I'm going to go a little bit more into that. So in case some of you have questions here, because, and again, not to throw trauma-informed care under the bus. It's beautiful. I think we just, right, just like with progress or any kind, there are little steps that we have to take in order to fully get to where we want to be. And then treatment-based, right, as well as the scarcity mindset. And again, this, if you remember that quote from Robin Kilmore, she talked about this, right? This idea of scarcity mindset versus abundance. And so if I'm thinking of, right, and I think it's a popular quote that we say, oh, let's think out of the box. And I definitely do. I actually think in circles. And so I'm going to show this set of possibilities, right? So this is what we think about. I think about when I hear young people who are organizing these days talking about the imagination space, right? We're really dreaming of a world in which none of us have lived in or through, right? So these possibilities, and what that requires is that we're actually addressing root causes, right? We're addressing the conditions that have caused these injustices and addressing those root causes rather than just treating superficially the symptoms. We're looking at things through an asset-based lens. We're really looking at the systems as being life-affirming, right? Life-giving. And to do that, we're looking at trauma, not just at the traumas, but really moving beyond that towards a healing-centered care. And instead of just treatment-based, where it's like a one-time thing, okay, we see you and you leave, it's really a matter of like engagement-based. So how do we build these relationships that are really deep? And then, of course, we have an abundance mindset, right? Because there is abundance. But the way that the distribution or the non-distribution of our resources, right, our economy is actually based on a scarcity mindset. And so really being able to break out of that mindset, I think, will allow for these possibilities. And so I want to just, take a moment right here to really think with you all through about how do we really then transform our healthcare system into systems of healing. Again, right, acknowledging injustice and actively working towards repairing and towards reparations, right? And so we're seeing this more and more, right? Even again, just acknowledgement that we are on stolen land. And the more and more that we do that, even though it's quite symbolic now, right? When we just acknowledge, or we have these, signs that say Black Lives Matter, love is love, these are symbolic acknowledgements. And that's the first step into making them truly embodied actions, right? And so I think, acknowledging, for example, the origin myth that is told in schools throughout the US, right? Disrupting these myths and the myths that have happened in stages. So what I'm talking about is, we're interrupting the first stage of the myth would be to name that European seizure of territory was already inhabited by indigenous people, right? And before the European invasion, just to contextualize, between 9 to 18 million indigenous people lived here in what we call North America. Now, by the end of the so-called American Indian Wars, which historians demarcate as a period between 1609 and 1924, about 250,000 indigenous people remained in the US, right? So we're talking from about 9 to 18 million people that's been reduced to 250,000 by the end of 1924. So this is the reference of genocide that I mentioned at the beginning of our time together. Right. And so the second stage of the myth that needs to be acknowledged is that the US could not have developed economically without the enslaved African labor. Right. And so that, again, right, has led to what I'm calling as our current state, right, of state-sanctioned violence that's connected to the police terror. The third phase of the myth, I would say, is needs to be acknowledged that another major formation of the US was the forceful seizure of almost half of Mexico, which is what we currently call today the southwest part of the US, because this expansion enabled the US to reach the Pacific. And then that opened up a whole nother, right, trade with Asia that we know led to a lot of, again, forced labor among the Asians. So another way that I think we can really transform our healthcare system into systems of healing if we're being radically relational, right? I think about this a lot, and we're not going to have time to go into it here, but there's a link here. GLB is short for Grace Lee Boggs, an amazing Chinese-American activist who really did a lot of her work in Detroit, Michigan. And what she is noted for was many things, right, as she lived to be 100. But one of the things that I really carry with me every day is thinking about this mantra, which is moving at the speed of trust, right? It also, I'm going to go ahead and share with you that it ties into this other principle that I really try to live by, which is choosing critical connections over critical mass, right? So when I'm thinking about being radically relational, I'm saying that it means I can recognize the humanity in you and say, I see you in your trauma, and I also see the whole self beyond that, right? And I see that you are resilient and that you have the capacity to heal. And again, depending on how you are embodied, right? Whether you're a white body, a Black body, an Asian body, disabled body, right? We all experience our different traumas because of how we are embodied in this moment in time. And when we're being radically relational, it means we're really building a relationship, especially when we're thinking about organizing, right? Where we're, again, moving at the speed of trust, which means we need to slow down and build relationships. Because when I can truly feel like I trust you, then I can say to you, hey, what you just said, even though you didn't realize the harm that you maybe caused me and others who are not going to say it, right? And I think as more of us are getting into this work around social justice, we're hearing, right, this idea of microaggressions. And that happens all the time. I'm sure it happened to many of you so many times before you even showed up in the Zoom call tonight. But what would it be like if I trusted you because we built this relationship, we moved at the speed of trust, or then I could say to you, hey, what you said really landed like this with me, and that you wouldn't take it personally because you realize that I'm not saying that to cut you down or to make you feel right. I'm just saying that because I'm trying to help us grow, right, in this mutual liberation, like to the freedom that I think a lot of us want to get to when we're in this work. And so this idea, again, of critical connections over critical mass, I see it as thinking about the depth of relationships, right, that really determine the strength of a system. And so Adrienne Marie Brown, who I've connected you to here, she talks about this in depth in her emergent strategy principles. And so I'll let you take a look at that at your own leisure and time, again, for just sake of time. But just think about even, thinking about when I heard her explain critical connections over critical mass, it was really beautiful because what she's saying is instead of going mile wide, which is what I know in organizing, when I first started organizing, we were doing, right? How many families am I calling to come to these meetings? And how many doors am I knocking, right? We're trying to be so mile wide. And really, she's saying what we should really start to focus on, and, right, not just the either or, but an and, is this critical connection. What would it look like if we were going mile deep with one person, right? Going mile deep instead of mile wide. So we're talking about breadths now instead of just width. Oops, this went backwards. You shouldn't have seen that last part, but it's okay. So these are the other ways that I'm just thinking, especially folks who are here, I think, who are interested in ways that we can transform our systems, that we're looking through asset-based lens and an abundance framework. And again, this is very much coupled with approaching health through a healing center engagement, which again, I referred to Dr. Sean Ginwright, who coined this term. And essentially what we're doing, right, because, as there was all this growing research with adverse childhood experiences and again, trauma-informed care, what we run the risk of is focusing on the treatment of trauma rather than fostering the possibility of wellness. And again, this is not an indictment of well-meaning therapists and social workers and public health workers, many of whom have been trained in the therapies and the techniques designed to simply reduce negative emotions and behavior, right? But just like Dr. Ginwright says, the absence of disease doesn't constitute health, nor the absence of violence constitutes peace. And so what healing center engagement does is it looks at healing as an individual and also a collective process. And just like the healing justice framework, it's explicitly political and not only clinical. And so I want to give you just an example when we think about how healing centered is strength-based, right? It really advances a collective view of healing and recenters culture as a central feature in well-being. So, researchers have pointed out the ways in which patients have redefined the terms used to describe their illnesses in ways that affirms, that humanizes, that dignifies their condition. So for example, in the early 1990s, AIDS activists challenged the term, quote, gay-related immune deficiency, right? Because the term stigmatized gay men and failed to adequately capture the medical accuracy of the condition. So in this similar way, the young men that Dr. Ginwright worked with offered him a way to reframe trauma with language that humanized them and holistically captured their experiences. I don't know, again, if everybody had the chance to read it, this article that Dr. Ginwright wrote, but in there he shares that, you know, while he's working with African young men, and all of them, you know, have experienced some form of trauma ranging from sexual abuse, violence, homelessness, abandonment, or all of the above. And during one of their sessions, when they were in these healing, you know, he was in a healing circle, he was explaining the impact of stress and trauma on the brain development and how trauma can influence emotional health. And as he was explaining, one of the young men just interrupted him and just abruptly stopped him and said, you know, I am more than what happened to me. I'm not just my trauma. And at first, I think Dr. Jen Wright says it puzzled him, right? But it didn't take him long to really realize what the young man was saying, right? Because our current formulations of trauma-informed care presumes that the trauma is an individual experience rather than a collective one. And so when we think about, right, BIPOC, the BIPOC communities that experience this collective trauma daily, right? When we see videos of police terror, or when we hear about Indigenous women and girls going missing and the like, we see that's what the media is focusing on. Again, this trauma, right? And so what trauma-informed care requires is that we treat trauma in the people, but it provides very little insight into how we might address the root causes of trauma. And if trauma is collectively experienced, this means that we also have to consider the environmental context that caused the harm, right, in the first place. Because by only treating the individual, we only address part of the equation, and we leave the toxic systems and policies and practices really neatly intact. And so that leads me to this sort of last part of what I'm thinking about when I think about how we can transform our healthcare system into a healing system, right? Is we're connecting the dots between these social issues, also known as social determinants, I think, in public health, but also known in the organizing world, right, as intersectionality, which again, I think for lack of time, there is a video here that is in this link that will link you to a video that where Kimberly Crenshaw is speaking, because she is the one who first coined this term in 1989. And Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. And so it's really essentially, she says, it's the study of overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, and discrimination.
So I just wanted to say just a couple more minutes so that we have time for Q&A for students.
Okay, that's perfect timing. Thanks, Vaishika. So I'm going to leave us with this, and it's really this beautiful quote by Audre Lorde, and she says, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And with that, there are going to be resources pages that you all can refer back to, and I will put myself on mute.
Oh, you don't have to.
No, okay.
So here are some of the questions. So it says, how do you get a person to think about healing when they're perhaps too busy worrying about when their next paycheck will come, where their next meal will come from, or about their safety?
Absolutely.
And these questions will also be put in the chat box as well. Right. Just letting you all know.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for that question. When we're talking to communities where, right, their basic needs have not been met, I'm not using the term healing, right? When I'm doing that to me, when I'm working with folks in that level, we're organizing, right? We're organizing so that they can get their basic needs met, right? Because it's true. And I've struggled this with many years, thinking about, you know, my own meditation practice and things like this, right? Where it's like, how can we talk about, right, these sort of metaphysical things and sitting down and meditating when folks are struggling to survive on a day-to-day basis. So again, I think contextualizing and using the appropriate terms, right, that connect with the community in order to talk about healing, right? And again, like I said, right, to me, community organizing eventually leads to healing, but that term may not be used specifically when we're, right, trying to, for example, you know, working with, you know, the Parent Advisory Council at CPS schools, right? Many of these schools have packed councils mainly because they are schools that are Title I, they have low income families. And so for me, I would never come in there and say, hey, come to this healing, centered engagement, right? Because again, I know that might be one, a triggering term, and then two, to this person who asked these questions point, how can they even think about healing when they're really just thinking about survival, right? I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you so much. So the next question was, are healing and repairing damage synonymous? And if so, can healing come through reparations? And they didn't mention any kind of monetary, they just meant reparations in general. They didn't make a specific, so it's kind of a broader idea of reparations.
Thank you. Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's synonymous. And again, this is my opinion. I wouldn't say it's synonymous in terms of healing equals, right, reparations. When I'm thinking about repair and reparations, I'm thinking from a restorative and transformative justice lens, right? Repair the harm, right? We're trying to reduce harm. We're trying to repair harm. That's not going to undo the harm that already was created, right? So folks might feel some healing. That's the hope, right? That through this restorative and transformative process, folks are going to find a sense of healing. But I think when I think about healing, I think about grief. And it's not, right, it's not linear. Grief is something that could just go away. And when we repair something, or there's reparations that have been given because somebody was harmed, it doesn't necessarily cancel out that, right, that harm to where it equates to like, oh, now I'm healed. Does that make sense? That healing is not linear, and that's the other thing. And I know that I've seen this beautiful picture and these, this quote going around, and I think of the same, right? Healing, grief, none of that is linear, right? It comes and goes, right? It's not this like very straight line of progression.
Yeah, thank you so much. Our next question is, the big discussion point for healthcare workers now is the movement from the discussion of burnout to the discussion of resiliency. Are you able to provide clarity and context to this kind of difference?
Ooh, I don't think I can, honestly, in the next 2 minutes, that is for sure. And I've been talking about community care, but I will say this, because I know the question was like, can I provide some clarity? We didn't get into it, but again, when I think of community care, right, versus self-care, I cannot ask, for example, I'll give the example of when I was, on the local school council at my daughter's public schools. When we ask parents to show up, right, if we're not providing childcare, we're not providing food because we're asking them to come at a time when it's the dinner time, right, where they're just leaving work to come home to cook for their family, then I'm not providing an actual structure and infrastructure for them to fully participate. And I feel like that's the same kind of lens that I come into it with self-care and community care. If I'm asking a single parent, right, a parent, whether it's a man or a mom or a dad, to go do some self-care, but I'm not providing any structure, infrastructure for childcare, for resources for them to actually go and take care of themselves or to step back for even an hour or 2 hours, then I'm burdening that person with an individual responsibility. And again, right, when we think about this idea of individual like traumas versus a collective trauma, then we're going to need to treat self-care within the context of community care. Right. And so I hope that gives you, whoever asked this question, I hope it gives you a tiny bit, but I do encourage you to go and read that article that Adrienne Marie Brown wrote in response to Be Low about the self-care, and because it speaks specifically to the organizing community and burnout.
Okay, and I believe we have one more in the queue. So this one's kind of long, but I'll get to it. Living and working in multiple communities, i.e. school, work, family, and friends that have varying needs, how can we promote self-care in our own lives that is responsive to all these communities, but that still leads to health and restoration rather than to burnout due to the demand of offering ourselves in each of these communities?
I think it ties back to that earlier question. And what I'm asking us to think about and lean into are when we're thinking about these traumas on a systemic and a collective, and in a collective trauma, right, and historical trauma, then I'm thinking we then have to contextualize this idea of self-care within that, that framework, right? That it's going to take, you know, if I want to step aside, for example, you know, when I was leading the work at the youth development at Palenque LSNA, if I needed to step away for a day or two to take care of my teams, right? What were the structures in place for me to actually do that and not feel that when I came back, I'd have 100 emails and then I'd be so far behind, right? It really requires us. And one of the things I think is really beautiful about what Adrienne Marie Brown says is that it really requires us to be vulnerable. I have to actually ask, like I have to express my needs. But most of us are not in a condition or in a job even, right, to be able to name what we need in order to step away and take care of ourselves before we're burnt out. And I think that's what I'm really asking is us to think about what's the infrastructure that needs to happen within your community, be it an organization, an institution, an organizing body that would allow for someone who is in any role, right? Whatever role they're in, it's an important role. And if they're not in that role, somebody, because they need to take care of themselves before they burn out, then something needs to shift in order to take some of that burden off.
Yeah, I definitely completely understand. And honestly, as someone, and I think many of us here, here, especially community members and students who are in the public health field have this understanding of you serve many communities, especially if you go to school or work or do something where you don't live. And so thank you so much. We would like to think you can put the little hand clap like reaction. And we would really love to thank you for being here for this session. So for all community members, the information is already on the Google site and the recording will be uploaded within the next few days or into early next week. For students who are students, please make sure you go over. We're going to switch over to the other Zoom room where we will do our activity for our action lab, which I'm really, really excited about. So we will leave this meeting. This meeting will be ended, and then we will all go to the other Zoom room and just be prepared to start around 6:35. So you have about 3 minutes to go do what you need to do. Thank you. Bye.